Hi, I am Václav Fuchsa, and today I want you to rethink whether your selectors aren't too stable. Let's see what's to come. I'd like to start this talk by saying a few words about me. Then I'll explain what I mean by too robust selectors and why they pose a problem. And finally, I'll tell you how to avoid them. Firstly, something about me. I was a scientist and a software developer in Perl, Python, C, Objective-C, and C#. I have spent the last 8 years in testing and its automation, and now I'm an automation tester at Česká spořitelna, the largest Czech bank. At work, I pursue code clarity and efficiency. I like to promote good practices by creating internal standards of test development and of almost everything else. I also do mentor my junior colleagues and senior colleagues, and sometimes even my bosses. In my free time, I enjoy studying at universities, regardless of the subject of the study. Well, currently I'm doing religious studies. And now let's dive into the core of my presentation. Firstly, we need a setup. I want you to imagine that we are testing the front end of web applications and that we are automating the existing manual scenario. Or when there is no manual scenario, you must assemble the scenario in our minds. Please, when you don't have the manual scenario at your disposal, don't underestimate this phase and always express in words what you want to test, even if it were just in your mind. You will see why later. Now, terminology. We will focus on selectors of web elements, and we will consider only the selectors that represent just one element, not their set. This is the most frequent case. So, what does it mean when we say that the selector breaks? It means that it stops representing the desired element when a change occurs. This situation is inevitable in some cases. For example, if the selected element ceases to exist, the selector has to break. Now, what I mean by a fragile selector. This is a selector which breaks after an insignificant change. And finally, we are coming to the term in the title of my talk, a too robust selector. This is the exact opposite of a fragile selector. This is a selector which doesn't break even after a significant change. But what is it makes too robust selectors bad? Don't we want our selectors to be as robust as possible, to become broken just in inevitable cases? Simply put, no. And that is because the too robust selector doesn't break even if the element lost its original meaning. And owning to it, the test where a too robust selector is used passes even if it should fail. It means the test gives a false pass. Here's a short example. The manual scenario says click the continue button while there is a continue button in the application. So, for instance, we would write something like click ID equal to button underscore continue to our script. We would execute our test and the test would pass. So far, so good. However, a change occurs in the application and the continue button is renamed to next. But the script remains the same as usual. So what will happen? In the most cases, the selector ID equal to button underscore continue remains to be functional and the test passes again. To sum up, we want to click the continue button as it is in the manual scenario, but there is no continue button in the application and the test clicking on this button passes even if it should fail. This is basically the ultimate reason not to have two robust selectors in our tests. Our tests will end up with false results. The situation is analogical to having tests with fragile selectors. It's actually the exact opposite. They would fail even when they should pass. We said that the selector that is too robust still refers to the original element after a significant change. But what change is significant? It means which change should be so important that it is allowed to break the selector. Is it the change of the element's name, of its class or classes, or its ID, or is the text the most significant part, or is it the position in domain object model, or is it their combination, or is it something else? We have to admit that as the automation testers, we often don't know. We might have a fair guess, but we are not the test designers. And essentially, this is not a technical issue. This is the issue of a test design. The technology must serve the design here, not vice versa. When we have a manual scenario in front of us, we only have one reasonable option: to act like the important things are the things considered important by the author of the set scenario. In other words, what is written in the manual scenario is significant and binding for us. That's it. Here's an example of what can be considered being important. The author of the manual scenario has many ways to specify an element, and they do so simply by a phrase. I've never seen a manual scenario stating, enter this text there with an arrow pointing to an input field. Elements are always described by words in scenarios. Here's a simple example. We want to click Add button in Phones section. And these are the words which the author can use for the description of the element. But they also might represent the same element as the green button in the second section. I don't think the second description is worse than the first one. For instance, imagine the situation where there are several buttons in the phone section. All of them are blue, but only the Add button is green. Then it might be the case that when users want to add a phone, they don't read the text on the buttons. They are just used to click the green one. And now we are coming to the very important question: how to avoid two robust selectors? The answer? We need to trust the authors that they were able to judge what users perceive and how they tend to think when using the application. In our example above, there are one who decides which description and which corresponding selector is more appropriate should be a human. Shortly, the author has a reason for choosing one of the possible descriptions, and we should follow his or her decision when automating the scenario. Otherwise, the selector might not match the human intention or perception of the user. This is also the reason why tools generating a selector after pointing at a web element will never be perfect. They don't know what is important for a human in his or her particular case. So the most important rule of selectors design, rule number 1, is humans judge. The first rule says we have to take seriously what is in the manual scenario. But this is usually not enough to design a proper selector. There could be more ways to design selectors. What I suggest is going for the meaning of the description of the element. Let's suppose the scenario says click the add button in the phones section. The same description as in the previous slide. Finding this add button is simple since there probably is a button element in a domain object model of that page that has the text add. However, there is no section element in HTML. Instead, a section would be represented by some vertical element, let's say div, having a class or other attribute expressing that this div represents a section. I would recommend using this combination for the description of the element as it captures the meaning of the description the most. Moreover, the section should be titled Phones. It means that the text Phones is written and visible at an important place of the section, probably in a header tag included in it. When we assemble the selector of this element, for example, as an XPath, we got something like this. It might not look the best, but it does capture the intention of the author. And besides, there comes a product placement. If you are using the wonderful browser library, you already know it extends possibilities of CSS and you can have a much cleaner description like this. And the last thing I want to say is, if you are still uncertain how to write your selectors, then prefer more stable and specific attributes. I think this point is quite clear and you might do it without even realizing. Nevertheless, I'll show you a real-life example of HTML code describing an input field for searching in a web application. Let's say we would have to enter something into the search field. There are few attributes of the field that, in our case, are not very useful. For instance, the autocomplete of is not very specific. The same goes with type equals text. That title equals to search and type something looks better, but it is too fragile because someone can change the text easily. This placeholder equals to search is, in our case, too restrictive because we want to work with the search field and not with the field with a text search. And that's why I wouldn't use any of these attributes. Instead, I would represent this field either with its ID or class or name. So, in my talk, I have explained what the two robust selectors are, why I consider them a problem, and how to avoid them. Now I like to summarize the rules. The first one is, if possible, use only those properties of the element and its position that the manual scenario uses. The second rule is, if there are more ways of describing an element even after using the first rule, go for the meaning of element's description in the scenario. And the last one, if you are still hesitant after applying these two rules, choose attributes that are stable and specific. In this way, results of your tests will meet human expectations, meaning they won't mislead the tester. And besides, your selectors will probably be more readable since they will express the meaning of their elements. That's all from me. I thank you for your attention and wish you happy coding.